when we have a RESTful API and a web application running in the same project, we need to be careful with different things. For example, now the way to act under some specific exceptions must be very different depending on if we are receiving a request for the RESTful API or we are receiving a request for the web project. Let's imagine that we want to get access to the home page without being authenticated. If we go there, we are obtaining an error that says unauthenticated, but this is not a good idea here because we are in a web application. We are not a JSON client or something like that. We are just a user probably requesting the web interface. So we should return some kind of error or redirection depending on the exception. And the same could happen if we, for example, try to send something like an invalid email or a wrong password. And the same happens if, for example, we send a wrong stuff here. Let's imagine that those fields are not required. And we are going to send a request without an email. So as you can see, we are obtaining a validation error, but again, it is our JSON response, and that should be not in that way. So let's change that. For that, we need a way to be sure when we are receiving a request from the web application. So for this, we are going to create a private function that is going to tell us if it is front-end. This needs to receive the request. And basically, we are going to say that it is front-end if two things happen. The first, the request accepts HTML. It means who is requesting our stuff accepts HTML. Normally, it should be our browser. But of course, any other client should accept HTML. And we don't want to return HTML responses if we are not completely sure that this is a web root. So how can we know if it is our root? Well, let's return first. Is the request accepts HTML? And now let's be sure that the request is a web request. So to access to the middlewares. So how can we know that? If you remember, in the root service provider, we have that other routes in the roots web stuff are using at least the middleware web. So we can do that in this way. We are going to obtain the information of the request about the root, and then a possible list of that middleware. But we need to be sure if inside of this list of middleware we have some middleware called web. So I'm going to create a collection from this array and use a method from the collection called contains. If the request contains a middleware called web, so it means that very surely it is a web request, and additionally is accepting HTML, so we could be pretty sure that we maybe are in the web version. Of course, that is not completely true, but we want here is just to be sure to returning JSON responses to must be, to who must be, and HTML responses who not. So now we are going to use the front-end method in the unauthenticated and the convert validation exception to response. So let's start here. If it is a front-end request, so we are going to return a redirect to the login page. In other case, we are still returning an error response saying unauthenticated. Now, in the validation exceptions, we have several possibilities. First, we are receiving a request directly from the user clicking buttons and etc., but we could have additionally received a request directly from an Ajax request, and that could be directly from the web platform, but it is an Ajax request. In the case of Ajax request, we are going to return a special error response, but not using the original format that we implemented, but we are going to use instead a simpler error response in order to avoid any kind of inconsistency with the parsing of that errors from the web version. So, again, if this is a front-end request, we are going to return depending if it is an Ajax request. So, if the request is an Ajax request, we are going to return a JSON response. Sending directly the errors with a 422 response. But if it is not an Ajax request, so we are going to return a redirect to the previous section with the original inputs and with the list of errors. After this, if it is not a front-end request, so we are still returning the traditional error response. So let's see how it is working now. So again, if we try to access the home location, we are getting now a redirection instead of the JSON error to the login page. Now, if we try to send an invalid login request without sending the email, we are obtaining now the redirection with the input maybe and the corresponding error. If we send now a valid email, but without password, we can obtain the same result, but in this case for the password validation. Of course, if we send the wrong email and or password, we have just that those credentials do not match our records. So it means that we have completely working good our RESTful API errors and the web version errors together. So see you in the next class.